people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. It's official. Early next year, David Benavidez, former champion David Benavidez, is going to be taking on former champion Caleb Plant. In my previous video, we talked about the commercial viability of this fight, what it might do at the box office, and whether or not there's really a demand for it. Here and now, we'll talk about the fight. The fight itself. Does Caleb Plant have the ingredients, the minerals, to upset the apple cart for David Benavidez?
Give him his first professional loss.
You know, sometimes what the fighter wants doesn't always align with what his management, what his promoter might want for him. We know that for the longest time, as far back as late 2019, Caleb Plant has been calling for this fight, whereas David Benavidez, rather, David's promoter, Samson Lukowicz, he wanted to wait. He wanted to let this thing marinate. He wanted to let it build, and as a result of that,
both boys ended up losing their titles over time.
Here they are. They're set to fight early next year, and you have to wonder,
Caleb Plant hasn't been running from this fight, quite the opposite. He's been running towards it. He's been calling for this fight perhaps more so than David himself. What is it in David he sees?
He's not a bigger guy than David, certainly not a bigger puncher.
Does he have what it takes to beat this guy? He got knocked out by Canelo Alvarez, and we all know that Canelo Alvarez, he doesn't have the physically imposing dimensions of a David Benavidez.
So what does Caleb Plant really have working for him going into this fight? Well, Caleb is a lot more defensively responsible than most, if not all, of the guys that David Benavidez has been fighting. He is a step up from those guys. I do think it's safe to say that.
So he's got defense, he's defensively responsible, he's got movement, he's got mobility, he's got a good set of legs under him.
I'd wager that Caleb Plant doesn't have to languish to make the super middleweight limit as much as David Benavidez. Let's not beat around the bush here. David Benavidez is really just a cruiserweight, cutting all the way down to super middleweight to maintain a size advantage over his quarry, and over time that can become physically taxing.
Over time it can become dangerous to consistently cut down that much, cut that much weight.
David has looked rather impressive over less than adequate competition, lackluster.
You know, he just goes in there, he mows guys down, gets off those shoe shines against what are stationary targets that are not as defensively responsible as Caleb and don't have his mobility. They don't fight on the balls of their feet. They're there to be hit.
You know, the camera and the crowds, they might love that stuff. You know, David, he's an entertaining fighter to watch, but make no mistake, Caleb is a more defensively responsible fighter than anyone David has shared the ring with so far. So that's really what Caleb's got working for him. What David's got working for him is that, well, Caleb Plant, you know, he has been stopped before by a smaller guy than David is.
Albeit a far more accomplished fighter, all the same. Caleb Plant, he has been stopped before, whereas David Benavidez, he's still an unbeaten fighter. He has his own tact. He doesn't know how to lose. Not yet.
Caleb's got to show him. Don't know if he can, don't know if he will. I'd say that David Benavidez, he's got size, he's got height and length on Caleb Plant. He is a more physically imposing fighter.
He is.
More prolific puncher.
Volume puncher, prolific, mid-range to inside guy.
Does his best work mid-range to inside, deep in the pocket, whereas Caleb can do a bit of work on the inside, but he's an outside fighter mostly.
Both boys have only seen action once this year, so they're on an even keel. You know, Caleb Plant, he's coming off that big knockout win over Anthony Durrell last month. David Benavidez earlier this year, he's coming off that knockout win over former middleweight champion David Lemieux.
Spectacular knockout win over a less than spectacular opponent. We all knew going into that fight that David Lemieux at super middleweight, at that point in the juncture, he was little more than cannon fodder for any capable super middleweight. He wasn't cut out to campaign up there, but that's what he was doing up until David stopped him. He subsequently retired after that fight, and that tells you all you need to know about where David Lemieux was in his career at that point. This is a step up in class for David Benavidez.
He's got one or two physical advantages over Caleb Plant that he's got.
Going into the fight, he will likely be the betting favorite with the bookies. The odds makers will likely have David Benavidez a considerable favorite over Caleb Plant. It's for this reason that there's more glory in it for Caleb than there is for David. If David knocks out Caleb...
If he knocks out Caleb Plant, all he's really doing is reheating Canelo Alvarez's sloppy seconds, even though he could have fought this guy
a long time ago, before Canelo fought him, before Canelo knocked him out. And if he does knock him out, well, all he's really doing is knocking out Canelo's sloppy seconds, whereas Caleb, if Caleb wins, he will have effectively slain the Mexican monster, as Mike Tyson so colorfully put it.
Yeah, he's the one who came up with that name for David, you know, because of the whole Charlo thing.
And yeah, perhaps the Jermall Charlo, David Benavidez might very well be a Mexican monster, but Jermall Charlo, you know, he's running away from the fight. Caleb Plant, for the longest time, has been running towards it. And if he can beat this guy, there's more glory in him beating David than David beating him. And don't forget that David is the WBC's reigning interim champion.
Brings him one step closer to either a Canelo Alvarez rematch or a newly vacated green belt, a newly vacated WBC title. It all depends what happens upon Canelo Alvarez's return. He's still this division's undisputed champion after all.
For my money, it's a good fight, and depending on what's on the undercard, I mean, if you can put some solid matches on that thing, I might actually buy it.
I'm not everybody, and pay-per-views, well, they aren't exactly selling like hotcakes these days due to piracy.
In all likelihood, this will be billed as a pay-per-view in the first quarter of next year. I'm hearing rumors and rumblings about January or February, that early. We'll see what happens, but, you know, it's a good fight. I just wonder if people are going to actually buy it. And just in keeping with the theme of men's super middleweight news, Morrell says, David Benavidez says nobody wants to fight him. Well, I'm here and ready.
A few months ago, the story was that David Benavidez and David Morrell would be fighting this fall.
Obviously, those plans changed because David Morrell's going to be taking on unbeaten Eidos Yerbossynuly
this weekend.
David Morrell has repeatedly insisted that all of his focus is on this weekend's fight and nothing beyond that fight. However, he does have a response to the often asked question of whether or not a showdown with fellow unbeaten super middleweight David Benavidez is in his future. Benavidez says nobody wants to fight him. Well, here I am. I'm here and ready to fight him. Morrell told BoxingScene.com.
David Benavidez has only seen action once, just once this entire year.
24-year-old David Morrell, he's seen action once, at least once already, back in June against Calvin Henderson. Stopped that guy in about 4 rounds.
This will be David Morrell's second fight this year, his second fight.
If he makes it through that guy this weekend, 2022 will have turned out to be a more productive year for David Morrell than it has been for David Benavidez. I mean, if all you've done this entire calendar year is beat David Lemieux,
who offered very little resistance for David Benavidez. I mean, David beat him easy.
He did. It just feels like David's handlers are pissing the time away.
There was a rumor a few months ago, that David Benavidez and David Morrell would be having their showdown in the fall of this year, before this year is out. That didn't happen, but I don't understand why it didn't happen. Why specifically? There was plenty of time to do it.
Well, perhaps not plenty resources. Perhaps there weren't enough fight dates to go around, not enough money to satisfy the fighters' financial demands, what they would want for that fight. The 24-year-old Cuban southpaw is set to defend his secondary WBA super middleweight title against mandatory challenger Eidos Yerbossynuly, 16-0 with 11 KOs, atop a November 5th Showtime tripleheader from the Armory in his adopted hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The fight is his second of the year, his previous outing also taking place at the Armory, where he stopped Calvin Henderson inside of 4 rounds on a June 4th Showtime card. Morrell's win came 2 weeks after Phoenix's Benavidez, 26-0 with 23 KOs, a former 2-time WBC super middleweight champion, blasted out faded former IBF middleweight titleist David Lemieux inside of 3 rounds to win the WBC
interim title. Lines him up for a Canelo Alvarez fight.
Why specifically David Benavidez didn't end up fighting David Morrell in the fall of this year? Your guess is as good as mine.
Members of Morrell's team used the buildup of that event to tease interest in a Benavidez versus Morrell fight happening once both won their separate bouts. It didn't work out that way.
Morrell steered towards defending against his mandatory challenger. Such a fight now seems back in play, with Samson Lukowicz, Benavidez's promoter, stating that the two will finally meet in May or June, as long as both win their next fights. Benavidez is presently due to return in the first quarter of 2023, and we know who he's going to be fighting. He's going to be fighting Caleb Plant. We just talked about that. That's a tough sequence of fights.
Well, it's about time. There's no excuse for a guy as young as David Benavidez to have only fought once, just once, this entire calendar year.
Pissing the time away. David Morrell's got to get through this Eidos guy from Kazakhstan, an unbeaten guy, a guy that looks like a handful, provided he does. He can look forward to fighting David at some point next year.
I mean, look, this is what it is. Provided that David Morrell makes it past this Eidos guy this weekend, it behooves David Benavidez to get David Morrell in the ring sooner rather than later.
David Morrell sports a professional record of 7 wins, no losses, and no draws. He's only got 7 fights. 7 fights. But they're moving him fast, and he's young.
He's only 24 years old.
He's got ability. He can box, he can punch, he's a southpaw.
Got a kid's got a ceiling. You allow this fighter to develop as a fighter under your nose, and you're just making your job that much harder later on.
Why specifically the fight between David Morrell and David Benavidez didn't materialize for the fall of this year, your guess is as good as mine. I can't blame either team because I don't know why specifically the fight didn't happen. I don't know who walked away from who. I don't know if any effort was made at all to do a fight between these two boys for this year. But what I do know is, the longer the fight takes to make, the more David Morrell is given the chance to develop as a fighter, to bank more rounds.
Garner more experience. I mean, you're obviously not fighting this guy now, that much we know. You're not fighting him now, but if you do end up fighting him later on, he will be a more experienced and developed fighter later on than he is right now.
It's the inference you can make if he makes it past this Eidos guy this weekend, an unbeaten guy with 16 professional contests and no losses.
About as solid a fighter as you can expect a guy with only 7 professional fights to share the ring with. They are moving David Morrell fast.
Consider that this Eidos guy, to the eye, is a more solid opponent, I'd say. A more solid opponent than the last guy that David Benavidez fought. David Benavidez last fought David Lemieux.
Very faded David Lemieux that retired immediately after that fight. Comparatively,
David Morrell is fighting a more solid fighter than the last fighter David Benavidez fought. David Morrell is also keeping a busier schedule than David Benavidez. Where David Morrell may end up fighting 2 times this year, David Benavidez fought only once.
The longer the fight takes to make, the more David Morrell might develop the skills he needs to beat David Benavidez. The longer the fight takes to make.
Samson Lukowicz, David Benavidez's promoter, said that provided that both boys win their next fights, they'll look to make the fight between them in May, sometime at or around May of next year. Can't hold him to his word.
Could end up taking longer than that to make the fight materialize.
And the longer the fight takes to make, the more time David Morrell will have been allowed to develop as a fighter.
That's what I see. Why specifically the fight between them didn't happen this year? I don't know.
But that's the situation. It behooves David Benavidez to get this guy in the ring sooner rather than later while he's still green, because if you wait too long to do this thing, he'll be fully developed. And finally, ahead of this weekend's big mega match in the light heavyweight division, reigning WBA champion Dimitri Bivol said, "I know Zurdo Ramirez knows. It's not true that I was ducking him." Dimitri Bivol and members of his team couldn't help but laugh. They think it's ridiculous that Gilberto Ramirez even suggested Bivol ducked him, especially since the unbeaten WBA light heavyweight champion embraced a showdown with the icon considered boxing's best pound for pound prior to Bivol's victory win. Bivol addressed Ramirez's claim during a preview of their fight Saturday night, Make the Days Count. Dimitri Bivol versus Zurdo Ramirez, which is available on DAZN and Matchroom Boxing's YouTube channel. Zurdo, Bivol said. He loves to talk too much. I remember when Zurdo was a network and promotional free agent. I remember in 2020 when he was between outfits, when he had left Top Rank, but he wasn't yet with Golden Boy. I remember Eddie Hearn saying in an interview that they offered Zurdo that fight, and Zurdo didn't take it. Now, you could argue that the fight is worth more money now than it was in 2020, back when the pandemic had first hit, and there was a lot of uncertainty. People were fighting behind closed doors in the bubble. You could argue that Zurdo made a wise business decision.
Turning the fight down then in order to have it later on when it was worth more money. Yeah, it's a smart business decision, but the idea that Bivol ducked you...
Dimitri Bivol's strength and conditioning coach, Taylor Ramsdell, promptly pointed out that Russia's Bivol wouldn't have defended his 175-pound championship against Canelo Alvarez if he were reluctant to square off with Ramirez. Of course. Every fight I was ducking him.
And amused, Dimitri Bivol said.
He told about this many times, but it's not true, and I know he knows it's not true, you know? Everyone knows in my team and in his team too, but he told it. Footage of Ramirez telling Bivol to stop running following his most recent win, a fourth-round knockout of Dominic Bosel in a WBA elimination match, was shown during the Make the Days Count featurette. Eddie Hearn, whose company co-promotes Bivol, explored a bout between Bivol and England's Joshua Buatsi, another fighter Hearn's Matchroom Boxing represents. After Bivol beat Mexico's Alvarez by unanimous decision in their 12-round match May 7th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, the WBA eventually ordered Bivol to face Ramirez next because the undefeated former WBO 168-pound champion is its mandatory challenger for Bivol's belt. Mexico's Ramirez clarified during the aforementioned preview that it was likely Bivol's team, not necessarily Bivol himself, that didn't want Bivol to face a big, strong southpaw.
Well, then why did you accuse Dimitri Bivol of running from you after your last fight?
Remember, after the Dominic Bosel fight, after the Dominic Bosel knockout, Zurdo Ramirez instructed Dimitri to stop running. Not Dimitri's team, not his strength and conditioning coach, not his manager, not his promoter, Dimitri himself.
You know what it is. You point a camera at some people, and they gotta put on a persona. They gotta put on a show. It's the name of the game. It's entertainment, after all.
Not him, Ramirez said. Maybe the team, because as a fighter, we want to fight. We fight with anyone. That's what we do. We're warriors. Bivol and Ramirez will meet in a 12-round battle between unbeaten 31-year-old boxers. DAZN will stream their main event worldwide Saturday from the Etihad Arena in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. DAZN's coverage of Bivol versus Ramirez's undercard is scheduled to start at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I know he wanted this fight for a long time, Bivol said. Me too. And now it'll happen. And I'm glad. He's a good fighter.
Neither Dimitri Bivol or Zurdo Ramirez are all that chatty. You know, they're not that talkative. But of the two, Zurdo is more the talker than Dimitri is.
It's the biggest fight of Zurdo Ramirez's career, though not necessarily the biggest fight of Dimitri's. Dimitri had the biggest fight of his career in his last fight against Canelo Alvarez, and he won that fight.
You know, one thing that caught my attention about Dimitri is post-fight after beating Canelo, he said he doesn't feel like he's the pound-for-pound king because, in so many words, Canelo Alvarez is naturally smaller.
He didn't all of a sudden become Mr. Big in the Britches after the Canelo Alvarez fight the way that Teofimo Lopez became Mr. Big in the Britches after the Lomachenko fight. After the Lomachenko, when, you know, Teofimo, he got a big head.
Dimitri didn't, because Dimitri is centered, and he's a consummate professional.
All this stuff about running and ducking, these head games, they're likely falling on deaf ears.